So we are in the third and the final week of a sermon series that we have entitled Uncluttered. And every week of the sermon series, I have started out with the same question. And I want to start out just like I did last 2 weeks with the same question, because I think this is an important question. I think it's one of those questions that we absolutely need to wrestle to the ground. And the question is this: what is it that you want this Christmas season? When you think about the next 10 days, what is it that you long for? What is it that you hope for? What is it that you wish happens? I think probably most of us are looking forward to certain things about Christmas, aren't we? Some of us are looking forward to parties or perhaps gift exchanges, or maybe the decorations are the part of Christmas that you really enjoy, that you're looking forward to, or perhaps some of us in this room are looking forward to at least one really good meal this Christmas season. But when you get underneath all that stuff, I think probably most of us long for the same thing. What we long for is transcendent moments with people that we love, our family and our friends. We want transcendent moments that are marked by true, meaningful, authentic peace, joy, happiness, contentment, harmony. I think if most of us were describing what we want for Christmas, it would probably be something similar to a Thomas Kinkade painting or perhaps a Norman Rockwell painting. Now the problem is that for most people, that's what we want, but there ends up being a massive gap when it comes to the Christmas season between what we want and what we actually end up experiencing. There ends up being this massive gap between what we want and long for and hope for and dream about and the reality that we all end up living. We want a Norman Rockwell experience, but we end up with something like National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. Christmas has just this unbelievable way of being chaotic. It just goes differently than we hope and we dream. And so what we're doing in this sermon series, as Kelly mentioned, is we're talking about the gap, how that gap between what we want and what we experience, and how we close the gap between the two. In week 1 and 2, we talked about our schedules and we talked about our finances. But today I want to talk about a third area of our life that has a tendency to just get cluttered up and go sideways during the Christmas season. What I want to talk about this morning is how we unclutter our life when it comes to relationships. There's something about Christmas, it seems, that can make relationships go sideways. It sometimes brings out the absolute worst in us, and I'm not sure why that happens. I don't know if it's because of the added stress of the season or the busyness or the expectations of people, or if it's because this is the one time a year where people who normally don't spend a lot of time together suddenly spend a lot of time together. But relationships can go really, really bad really quickly during the Christmas season. And we can find ourselves in places where we're wondering, well, what am I supposed to do with this? The relationship's been cluttered all of a sudden for some reason, and we find ourselves wondering, well, how do I navigate this? How do I unclutter this cluttered relationship? Now, thankfully, Jesus knew we would face situations like this. He knew we would find ourselves in moments where the relationship would go sideways and we were trying to sort through what to do. So in John chapter 13, Jesus gives his most powerful piece of instruction regarding relationships. It's the most powerful one. It's the one that has the greatest capacity to help us unclutter the relationships in our life. Interesting for me, Jesus actually gives this piece of instruction while he's celebrating Passover. Passover is the biggest holiday on the Jewish calendar. It was as big for them as Christmas is for us. So as he's in the middle of celebrating the holiday with his disciples, he gives this advice. Now, what's also interesting to me is that before this meal takes place, not too long prior, his disciples found themselves in a place where their relationships with one another got cluttered. They ended up in an argument with one another. And you would kind of imagine that these guys who'd been walking with Jesus and learning from Jesus and spending every waking moment with Jesus 24/7 for 3 years, that they probably would be arguing about how do we help Jesus' message go farther, faster? Or perhaps they might be arguing over, well, how do we help Jesus be more effective at what he's come to do? Or you might even imagine that they would argue about, well, how do we help the under-resourced? Jesus seems very concerned about the under-resourced. How do we help them? But the thing that the disciples were arguing about was probably the most petty thing that a group of people could be arguing about. Their argument was, which one of us is going to be the most important, the most powerful, and the most prominent when Jesus becomes king. Now, they didn't understand that Jesus wasn't thinking that he would become the type of king that they thought he was going to become. Nevertheless, they get in this argument. And I imagine it probably started the same way many arguments in our life started. Perhaps somebody did something that rubbed somebody wrong, or perhaps somebody said something that rubbed somebody wrong, and then people start responding and reacting, and before you know it, blood pressure rises and voices rise, and there's a full-blown argument by the people that are literally about to become the leaders in Christ's church about who's going to be the most important. The argument gets so out of control that Jesus has to step in and he has to set the record straight. He has to help them understand, no, greatness in my kingdom is marked by service. So when they get to the Passover meal, there's still an elephant in the room. There's still tension. There's still this cluttered relational dynamic that they have going on. So they start celebrating the Passover meal. And this particular Passover meal was, for the disciples, I tend to believe, the most bizarre Passover meal they ever celebrated. It started out with Jesus standing up and picking up a piece of bread and breaking it and telling the guys, look, this is my body, which is going to be broken for you. This do in remembrance of me. And the disciples are looking at each other going, what? What is he talking about? And then Jesus picks up the wine and he says, guys, this is going to represent my blood, which is going to be shed for the forgiveness of sins. And again, the disciples, they don't know what Jesus is talking about. They know he's trying to share something important. They know that maybe there's some sort of meaning there behind what Jesus is saying. And I kind of picture the disciples looking at each other going, dude, do you understand what he's saying? No, you don't either? He says the weirdest stuff. And some dude over here goes, dude, just smile and nod. Maybe he'll end up telling us what he's talking about. But Jesus finishes the thing, and then he sits down and leaves them to try to figure it out for themselves. And their heads are spinning, and they're going, man, this thing has already started off weird. And then all of a sudden, Jesus stands up without warning and starts walking across the room. And as he does, he gets everybody's attention, and every eye is on Jesus, and they're wondering, what is he going to do now? This is so crazy. This is the weirdest Passover I've ever had. This is like the National Lampoon's Passover vacation. I mean, this is crazy. What's going on? And Jesus just goes over, and he picks up the servant's towel. He goes to the servant's station, he picks up the servant's towel, he picks up the pitcher and a cup of in the water, and he starts walking over where the disciples are. You see, Jesus has decided to address the elephant in the room. He knows the relationships are still cluttered. He knows they're still interested in who's important and who's the most powerful and who's going to have this and who's going to have that. And he knows the relationship's cluttered. So he does something to sear this idea into their mind. And he begins washing feet. Now, the reason why this is so significant is because in Jesus' day, when you had an event like this, there was almost always somebody there to wash people's feet. And it was always reserved for the person who was considered to be on the lowest end of the totem pole. If there were servants available, the lowest servant would do it. But apparently there wasn't a servant there that day, and no disciple decided to take it upon themselves to do it. They're just still interested in who's number one. And so Jesus walks over and he sits down and he starts washing the disciples' feet. And I can imagine at this point, you could hear a pin drop. All you can hear are the sounds of the water as Jesus washes people's feet. And the disciples are ashamed and they're embarrassed because they know of all the people in the room, the very last person in the room that should be doing that is Jesus. But Jesus just goes around person by person by person, and the longer it takes and the more he does, the more uncomfortable it becomes. He gets around to Peter, Peter resists, and then Jesus insists, and so he washes Peter's feet too. And when he's done, he takes everything back. He comes back, and people are just going, this is so strange. And it's uncomfortable, and there's tension in the room. And Jesus says, look, guys, greatness in my kingdom is when people serve. And their heads are spinning and they're trying to figure it out, like what's going on? And then all of a sudden, without warning, Judas just gets up and without explanation just leaves the room. And people are going, man, this is so weird. Like it's the weirdest vacation holiday season I've ever had. Like what's going on? Now the disciples, they don't know that this is the last Passover meal that they're going to celebrate with Jesus. They have no idea what the next few days will bring. But Jesus knows that these are some of the final moments that he's going to have with his disciples. He knows that although they don't know it now, the things that are happening in this moment and the things that are said in this moment will be sealed and seared onto their memories till the day that they die. So Jesus knows that there's some important stuff that needs to be said. He also knows that for the disciples, relationships from here on out are not going to become less cluttered. They're going to become more cluttered and more complex. And so Jesus waits until he has their attention. He waits till their eyes are looking at him. And he leans in for emphasis and he gives the greatest piece of relational instruction that he ever gave. And here's what he said. A new command I give you. Now, if you're one of the disciples, you're thinking, Jesus, really another one? Like we already have like 600. We have over 600, Jesus. I can't tell you what all of them are. I'm pretty sure today I violated at least 50 or 60 of these things. And now you're adding another one? Jesus, do we really need another commandment? I mean, like I've got all kinds of things I need in my life, but a new commandment is not one of them. But Jesus proceeds and he says, love one another. Now, what's interesting to me about what Jesus does here is he takes love and instead of using it as a noun, he makes it a verb. And as he does, he subtly communicates this. Love is not primarily a feeling. Love is something that we do. So he turns it into a verb and he says, now go love. I kind of picture Jesus if he were here in the holiday season. Can you imagine him as a relationship counselor? You know, imagine that husband and wife who are going through the holiday season and they're stressed out and they're at wit's end and they can't agree on money, they can't agree on what they're going to do, they can't agree on what they're going to buy, and they just are at each other's throat. And so finally they go to the relationship counselor, Jesus, and they for 30 minutes they go back and forth and throw each other under the bus and talk about how terrible the other person is and bicker back and forth. And finally Jesus calls a timeout, hold timeout, guys. Hey, stop arguing, go home. Love one another. You're welcome. Can you imagine this? I mean, I picture Jesus as the relationship counselor and that family that has all these moving dynamics and expectations, and you got to be at this house at this time to do Christmas, and no, we want them first, and they got to do a meal with us, and all this sort of stuff, and husbands and wives are trying to figure it out, trying to keep everybody happy, and then the in-laws get involved, and that gets messy and hairy, and all the tension starts to rise, and eventually the family, the extended family, everybody go to Jesus, the relationship counselor, and they just unpack it all with Jesus, and he's just like, look, stop with this petty stuff. Stop arguing. Go home. Love each other. And the disciples, when they hear this, love one another, they're thinking, Jesus, this isn't new. You've told us this. I know you repeat yourself a lot, and maybe you've forgotten that you've told us this, but look, we're all crystal clear. You've actually said this before. I mean, we were all there, Jesus, when you said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And then you gave that killer story illustration thing about the Good Samaritan to kind of visualize for us what this all looks like. Jesus, this isn't anything new. And I can almost hear Jesus saying, wait for it. Wait for it. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. And the disciples went, oh. You see, Jesus doesn't tell the disciples, what I want you to do is love the way that other people love you. And he doesn't even tell them, love the way you want to be loved. He says, and this is the new part, as I have loved you, so you must love one another. Now, when you and I read that statement, we immediately think about the cross, don't we? We think about what Jesus did there. But the disciples, they didn't know any of that was going to happen. They had no idea what the next few days, what would unfold in the next few days. So when Jesus says, as I have loved you, so you love one another, what they do in their mind is they have those flashback moments where they think about these moments where Jesus loved them. Nathanael, no doubt, thought back to the moment where he kind of insinuated about Jesus and Jesus' hometown, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And of course, I'm sure Nathanael remembers how Jesus didn't go back and forth with him. Jesus didn't try to get even. Jesus didn't try to one-up him. Jesus didn't guilt him or shame him or anything like that. He just simply invited him to be his friend. Come follow me, Nathanael. Come follow me. We're going to let that one go. And I imagine that Matthew, the tax collector, thought back to moments where he was a tax collector and nobody liked him and nobody wanted to be around him and everybody gossiped about him behind his back and trash talked him and drug his reputation through the mud and nobody wanted to be his friend. Nobody would come over to his house. And then Jesus shows up. Jesus didn't destroy Matthew's reputation. He really didn't even spend any time talking to him about all the wrong he had done. He just simply loved him and invited him into friendship and then went over to Matthew's house. And I'm sure Peter thought about moments where he literally opened his mouth and inserted foot. For Peter, there were a lot of those moments. Moments when he spoke without thinking about it and things he said were brash and harsh and just outlandish. And Jesus could have totally shamed him. Jesus could have become angry. There's a number of things that Jesus could have done. But instead, Jesus just loved Peter. I'm sure every one of them thought back to moments. Moments where they wanted to stop following Jesus. Where he was asking them to do things they didn't want to do things that they felt like were too hard. Where Jesus was saying things that were just very difficult to deal with, and Jesus was doing things that they didn't want him to do. And I could bet you all these guys thought back to moments where they were thinking about unfollowing Jesus. And in moments when they were thinking about being unfaithful to Jesus, Jesus was still faithful to them. You see, this was a very intensely personal statement for the disciples. And while all of this is settling in, Jesus finishes with this clincher statement. He says, "By this everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another." Guys, this is what's going to separate us from everybody else. Love as you have been loved. And then, a couple days later, Jesus would go and he would put his full love on display, not just for the disciples, but for the entire world when he died on a cross to buy forgiveness for our sin. And as he did, he left behind this powerful relationship instruction that has this uncluttering effect on the relationships in our lives. He said, "Love as you have been loved." And the disciples, they got the message loud and clear, and they taught everybody who would become a Christ follower that they encountered, look, this is what we do. This is how we navigate relationships. We love as we have been loved. And this love as you have been loved became the predominant relationship ethic of the entire Christian faith from this moment on. And the New Testament writers, they picked up on this theme. And they did what the other guys did. They taught it and they taught it and they reinforced it and they taught it and they reinforced it and they brought it up in a lot of their writings. If you go to 1 John, you read his book, he is absolutely obsessed with this idea of loving one another. In fact, he argues in his book, adamantly, that if you don't love people, you may not actually know God. And the Apostle Paul, a guy who I don't really think is all that lovey-dovey, touchy-feely, every time I read his writings, I never come to that conclusion. He has a lot to say about this too, this loving one another thing. In Romans, his letter to the Romans, he tells them, look, owe nobody anything except for a debt of love. In other words, what he sort of tells them, he says, look, because we've been loved this way by Jesus, because we've been loved this way by God, we now owe every single person we ever come in contact with a debt of love. And then, on another occasion, he would be writing to a church in Galatia, and he would be talking to them about the fruits of the Spirit. And as he would list them out, love would find its place in the number one slot. And he would subtly tell the Galatians that love is evidence of God working in your life. But perhaps the most powerful and most strongly worded instruction regarding love is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Paul is the one who writes this letter, and he writes it to a church in Corinth that he actually started. And this church had a lot going for it. They were gifted, they were influential, they had money, they were doing things. The problem is they had lost sight of the love for one another thing that Paul had instructed them to do. They were fighting and they were arguing over really dumb stuff, just like the disciples, like who's best and whose spiritual gift is most important and whose spiritual gift is least important. They're trying to rank people in some sort of ranking system, and they're suing each other in court, and they had taken the Lord's Supper and they turned it into this selfish thing rather than this thing where we celebrate and reflect the love of Jesus Christ. They turned it into something completely different. And so Paul decides to address this with them in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. It's a passage you're probably familiar with, but I want to look at it for a minute. Here's what he tells them. If I speak in the tongues of men or of angels. So Paul says, look, even if I'm the most brilliant orator to ever grace the face of this ball of earth, the earth that we call earth, this ball of dirt that we call earth, if I'm the most gifted guy, if I stand up and I'm so eloquent that immediately I engage and immediately I inspire and people are drawn to me, people far and wide, even if people from several countries over travel, go great lengths to come see me, and even if I can do this in any language that I choose, even if I'm so eloquent that you would swear that the angels themselves are talking, but I don't have love, I'm only a resounding gong or a clinging cymbal. Doesn't matter how impressive my gifts are or what I do with them. It's absolutely worthless if I don't love. He continues. If I have the gift of prophecy, which, by the way, in the next chapter, in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, Paul is going to argue that it's the most desirable of all the spiritual gifts because when we use it, we're ministering to God's people. He says, look, even if I'm the most gifted prophet you've ever met, like when I talk, it's like it comes from the very mouth of God. And I can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge. So even if there are things in this world that don't make sense to anybody, but I get it. And I know everything that there is to know. You can ask me about anything, and I can inform you ad nauseum about those things. And if I have faith that can move mountains. Paul says, look, even if I have the type of faith where I can look at a mountain and I can tell it to move, and it says, when and how high? Jump, when and how high? Some of us in this room, by the way, are probably struggling to have faith just to make it through the week. And Paul says, if I have the type of faith where I can instruct a mountain to move, and it moves, but I don't have love, I'm nothing. He continues, if I give all I possess to the poor, in other words, if I go home during the Christmas season and my heart gets broken for the under-resourced and I sell and liquidate all my assets, and then I distribute it all so that the only thing that I have in this life is literally the shirt on my back. Even if I do that. And then even if I go farther than that, and if I give my body over to hardship, the idea here is that Paul's saying, look, even if I go serve Christ in such a way that I experience persecution and torment and maybe even be put to death, but I don't have love, I gain nothing. To help you understand what Paul's saying here, I want you for a moment to imagine the largest number that you can think of. The largest number that you know of. Pick it real quick, get it in your mind. For me, it's 1 trillion. I don't know what comes after 1 trillion, so whatever for you. Now I want you to take that number and I want you to multiply it. We're about to do math, you ready? Multiply it by 0. What do you get? 0. Every single time. Doesn't matter how big or impressive the number is. Doesn't even matter if the number is so big you can barely comprehend it. You multiply it by 0, you get 0 every time. So what Paul's saying is, look, it doesn't matter how smart you are. It doesn't matter how strong you are. It doesn't matter how talented you are. It doesn't matter how athletic you are. It doesn't matter how great your leadership gifts are. It doesn't matter what you've accomplished in this life. If you don't love, it's worthless. Pretty strong words. Now from here, what Paul does is he starts to give a list. I think what he does is his goal here is to create a mental picture because he's trying to remind this church, look, I've been saying from the beginning, love as you've been loved, love as you've been loved, love as you've been loved. But he doesn't want to leave any ambiguity in their mind. And so he starts to describe what love looks like and what love does and what love doesn't do. And here's what he says. He says, love is patient, which, let's be honest, if most of us were creating this list, this probably would not be on our list, and it definitely wouldn't be at the top of our list, right? For most of us, we don't think about patience as a virtue. Most of us are on very short supply when it comes to patience. In fact, we might even be impatient with patience, right? But Paul starts there. The idea behind patient is that it's this idea that someone has been slighted or somebody has been wronged, and they have it completely within their power to retaliate, but they don't. Then he goes on and he says, love is kind, or love acts. Love doesn't just feel, it does something. It doesn't just feel generous, it acts generously. It doesn't just feel compassion, it acts compassionately. And then he continues and he says it does not envy. In other words, love doesn't focus on our differences. You know, as people, we're so good at doing that, aren't we? But that's not love. Love doesn't focus on our differences. It doesn't boast. It doesn't try to make people feel bad about what they do or don't have. It is not proud. He continues. It does not dishonor others. When Paul says it does not dishonor others, what he's trying to say is that it's sensitive to other people. It takes into account the likes and the dislikes and the preferences and the feelings of somebody else. He's saying love is not brutal. You know, occasionally I bump into people who are rather, when they speak truth, they drop it like a bomb. And almost always there's some sort of an explanation. They say, well, you know, I'm just a straight shooter, or I just speak my mind, and people don't like it, and some people can't handle it, and there's always an excuse. But I think what Paul would say is, no, you're a jerk, and you're trying to excuse it. I don't mean that mean, but that's what's happening. You're not loving. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It seeks the interest of other people first, the needs of other people. It is not, and this is the one that's going to get most of us, it is not easily angered. Now, Paul here isn't saying that there's not an appropriate time to get angry. There is an appropriate time, and there are certain things that are appropriate to be angry about. But what he's saying is that love is not easily angered. You know, this Christmas season, you can claim to love all kinds of people. You can claim to love your spouse, but it's going to be fairly unconvincing if you're constantly getting angry at them for things that they say and things that they do. This Christmas season, you can say that you love your kids, but if you're constantly getting angry at them and you're constantly yelling at them because they inconvenience you somehow, or they're annoying for some reason, or if they do something that causes you to change your plans, it's just not very convincing that you actually do love them. It's not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. When Paul says that, it keeps no record of wrongs, that's a bookkeeping term. It carries the idea that well, the reason why you have bookkeepers is they keep track of every transaction and they record it so that they can go back later and use it and leverage that transaction that was recorded. And what Paul's saying here is that he said, look, love just intentionally forgets. Love doesn't keep a record of past wrongs. And again, I think many of us can be guilty here of doing this. If you've ever found yourself in a moment where you got in a fight with your spouse or a fight with a loved one and you just started pulling out the history book. You know, last week you did this and the week before you did that and then 3 weeks, and then before you know it, they're dragging out the thing that you did 6 years ago, 7 years ago. And I'll tell you how you know you're doing it. Here's how you know you're doing it. If you say things like, well, you always do this, or I knew you would do this, or you never. That's history book stuff. You're keeping an account of wrongs. Love doesn't do that. Paul continues, love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. What Paul's ultimately saying with this statement is he's saying, look, love does not find any delight whatsoever when other people stumble, when other people make mistakes, or when other people fall. If there's somebody in your life that you enjoy currently or have enjoyed currently watching them fall or bad happen to them, you weren't loving. Paul says that doesn't happen when we love people. He continues, it always protects. Now, when Paul uses this word in the Greek language, he kind of invites the readers to picture something, to kind of picture the way that this works. Let me give you a scenario that would probably be kind of in line with what Paul's thinking here. Imagine for a moment there's a boat, and it's out in the middle of the ocean, and it encounters an unexpected but violent storm. And that boat gets absolutely battered. Wind, rain, waves, it gets thrown all over the ocean. But no matter what happens, it stays afloat, and it protects the people on the boat. That's the idea of what Paul's trying to communicate when he says it always protects. Love keeps people safe. So are people safe with you? Are they safe with you when they're not with you? Is their reputation safe when they're not around you? Love protects. There's no place for gossip with people who are loving. If we're loving people, we refuse to gossip and we refuse to allow it to happen. We won't stand for it. Why? Love protects. Then he goes on and he says, love always trusts. Which essentially means this: love gives the benefit of the doubt. When you and I see people and they say something and they do something and we don't like it or it sits wrong on us, what we do oftentimes is we come to conclusions about motive. Here's why that person did that. We're not always aware that we're doing it, but we do this, I'm telling you. And what Paul's saying is what love does is love chooses to believe the best in that person. Paul's not calling us here to be naive. What he's saying is the starting point, the default, is to choose to believe the best in people. He's saying to do what Andy Stanley calls give a generous explanation. So believe they're doing it for good reason until you're proven otherwise. He goes on, love always hopes, which means that love is forward thinking. Love doesn't dwell on the past. It's not that it ignores the past. That's not where it leaves its attention. Its attention is on the future. When it looks at people, what it does is it believes that the future for them will be better than either their past or their current reality. They believe that no matter what they've done, no matter what sin they've committed, that the future is better, that God's working on their heart, and just like he's working on yours, and he is making him or her more and more into the image of Jesus Christ. Love always hopes, and then he says love always perseveres. which is Paul's way of saying, no matter the difficulty, no matter how long, love strives to preserve the relationship. And then he finishes this way, love never fails. Now, right about here, I picture the Corinthian church protesting and doing the same things that you and I do. But Paul, you don't understand. You don't understand what they said. You don't understand how many times they do it. Paul, you don't understand how much they get under my skin. You don't know what they've done. Paul, you just don't understand. They just drive me nuts, and I can't, and just this thing, and Paul will go, no, time out. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter because we love like we have been loved. You see, the reason why Paul can describe love this way, he's not just telling them how to do it, he's reminding these Corinthians, and really you and me, he's reminding us of the way that we have been loved by God. The reason why we are patient is because God is patient with us. The reason why we're kind is because God is kind with us. The reason why we protect is because God protects us. The reason why we believe the best in people is because God did that for us. The reason why we don't delight in other people when they fall and make mistakes is because that's what God did for us. The reason why we don't focus on our differences because that's what God didn't do that for us. We love as you have been loved. Now let me be super clear here. I'm not saying if you actually love and love well that it's going to fix every relationship that you have. What I am saying is that if you find yourself in the middle of cluttered relationships, the love as you have been loved principle that Jesus established will make the way forward absolutely clear, without question. Which means that when it comes to the relationships in our life this Christmas season and really beyond, the most important, the most powerful question, the most uncluttering question that we may ever ask ourselves is this one right here. What does love require of me? I'm telling you, it's unbelievably clarifying. You probably will encounter cluttered relationships this Christmas. The good news is we've been given direction. Love as you have been loved. So, when you encounter it, some of you maybe already have, what does love require? And that's how we unclutter the relationships in our life.